Okay, now let's turn our harmony to section 182. And we now come to the 11th division of our study, which is going to be the resurrection and the ascension of the King, from 182 to 197. On the Jewish calendar, it's the 17th of Nisan. The Western calendar, April 9th, AD 30. And this is the third point of the gospel. Gospel, first point, he died for our sins. Second point, he was buried. And now the third point, he rose again. We talked about the theological significance of key events, which included his baptism and then also his what is the word? His transfiguration. And then we talked about the significance, theological, of his death and burial. Now we'll deal with the theological significance concerning the resurrection of the Messiah. Now, so significant to him specifically, it proved him to be the Son of God in Romans chapter 1, verse 4. Secondly, it confirmed the truth of all that he said, according to Matthew chapter 28, verse 6. Thirdly, it means that he is the first fruits of the first resurrection. And keep in mind, there are two kinds of resurrections in Scripture. The one kind is the restoration back to natural life, and those who were raised back to natural life, like Lazarus, would die again later. He's the first one to be resurrected in the second kind of resurrection, which leads to resurrection to immortality. He's the first one so far resurrected in that form, in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 20 to 23. And fourthly, it was a declaration of the Father that the Messiah met all the requirements of the law of Moses, according to Philippians chapter 2, verse 9. Second category is significance to all people in general. It makes certain the resurrection of all men, both believers and unbelievers, in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 20 to 23, not for the same destinies or the same time, but does involve both types of resurrections. And secondly, it guarantees the judgment of all unbelievers. And this is Paul's statement in Acts 10, verses 40 through 42. I should say not Paul's, but Peter's statement in Acts 10, verses 40 through 42, and Paul's statement in chapter 17, verses 30 and 31. A third category, significance to the saints of the Old Testament, the saints of the Hebrew Bible. It included the fulfillment of Old Testament promise of their salvation. It meant the removal of their sins and the guarantee of their future resurrection in Acts 13, verses 32 and 33. And the fourth category is the significance to believers. It proves our justification. Now we're justified by means of his death, but his resurrection proves the fact of our justification, Romans 4, verses 24 and 25. Secondly, guarantees power for the believer's service. Whatever he calls us to do, he'll empower us to be able to do so. Ephesians 1, 17 through 20. It also guarantees the believer's individual resurrection, as pointed out in Romans 8, verse 11, 1 Corinthians 6, verse 14, and 2 Corinthians 4, verse 14. Fourthly, it means the forgiveness of the believer's sins in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 7. Fifthly, it designates the Messiah as the head of the church in Ephesians 1, 20 to 22. Also, it means the Messiah now has the keys of death as far as believers are concerned. In Hebrews chapter 2, verses 9 through 18. Also found in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 13 through 15. There's an exception to the rule that we talked about earlier this week in cases of believers who are excommunicated from the assembly. Then Satan has the right to put that person to death, though the spirit is still saved. But outside of that one exception, whenever a believer dies, it is Yeshua that puts us to sleep. Also, it means there is now a sympathetic high priest in heaven, in Hebrews chapter 4, verses 14 through 16. Now let's look at section 182. You've got in the harmony parallel Matthew 28 and Mark 16, but actually the two separate events. And notice Matthew wording, and keep in mind he's writing to a Jewish audience. Now late on the Sabbath day, as it began to dawn, toward the first day of the week. And in English, not the language I suspect, when you see the word dawn, it means the wee hours of the morning when light begins to arise on the horizon, though the sun is not yet visible. But in the original language, it simply means the beginnings of a new day. And keep in mind, Jewish reckoning of day is from sundown to sundown. When it says late on the Sabbath day, as it began to dawn towards the first of the week, means it's very late on Saturday afternoon. As slowly as the day wanes, and once three stars are visible, that is when the first day of the week begins. When the Sabbath ends at sundown Saturday, that's also when the first day of the week begins. And in this occasion, the two Miriams went to go and see the sepulchre, and once again they knew where the sepulchre was. Then chronologically after that, in Mark 16, verse 1, when the Sabbath was passed, you have again the two Miriams, but also Shulamit. They brought spices that they might anoint him. So we're dealing with the wee hours of Sunday morning. And again, they don't anticipate any resurrection occurring. So in section 183, we have the opening of the tomb. And notice three things here. First of all, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and just as a great earthquake marked the very point of his death, a second earthquake marks the very point of his resurrection. Secondly, an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled away the stone. And when this angel rolled the stone away, he broke the Roman seal. And because he broke the Roman seal, what the Roman soldiers should have done is immediately have the angel put under arrest. But you don't go around arresting angels, especially in verse 3, his appearance was as lightning, his raiment white as snow. The third thing that happened is they became fearful. In fact, they were so afraid, they became as dead men. There was some expression in American English, we say when somebody is scared stiff. He's scared stiff, meaning he's so scared he cannot move, one way or the other. And that's what happened with this Roman guard initially. It became as dead men. They could not either move towards the angel or away from him. In section 184, you have the visit of the woman. They come in two groups. The first one is in John's account, verse 1, the group of one, Miriam Magdalene. And when she arrives at the tomb, what she sees, the stone has been rolled away. The tomb is empty. She does not see any angels. And so she leaves the tomb area to inform the apostles of what she suspects. That what she suspects is incorrect. After she's gone, the other women come into the garden tomb area, and they do see the angels. An angelic message to these other women is two things. Number one, Messiah is risen as he himself had said. So Luke's account, verse 5 and 6, there's no reason to seek the living among the dead. But secondly, they're told to go to the apostles and tell them the Messiah has been resurrected, and they are to leave Jerusalem immediately and head for the Galilee, and he will meet with them in the Galilee once they get there. And this is the second time they received this command, because during the last Passover, he warned them that he would be arrested that night, and they were told to immediately leave the city, head for the Galilee. He'll meet them there, because of the failure to fully understand what he's been teaching them about the death and resurrection program, the program of two comings. But they're still not understanding this, so they never leave town. At this point, three things happen. In Luke verse 8, they remember the prophecy that he'll be resurrected on the third day. In the Mark's account, verse 8, they told no one outside the apostolic group, but in Matthew verse 8, they did inform the apostles that Yeshua has been resurrected based upon the angelic testimony. However, this first report of the resurrection is simply disbelieved. So in capital D, you have the report to the apostles. Now Mary Magdalene informs only two of the apostles, which is Simon, Peter, and John. And the other woman tells the other apostles. And when they heard their report, in Luke verse 11, these words appeared in their sight as idle talk, and they disbelieved them. Luke goes on to point out in verse 12, Peter arose to run to the tomb area. And in John's account, we learned that it was not just Peter, but also the apostle John. Now, John outruns Peter. He does not go inside the tomb. He simply bends down, and he sees two things. First of all, the strips of cloth that was around him is still around it. It's empty. Nobody's in it, but the strips of bands were not unwrapped, which shows that his resurrection occurred right through the grave clothes. Peter is a bit more impetuous, finally catches up, and he runs immediately into the tomb. He sees the same evidence that John saw. First of all, the strips of cloth are still wrapped up and so, but secondly, the headpiece was separated from the body piece, again showing that whatever the shroud of Turin might be, it is not the shroud of the Messiah. Now, when the two men leave the tomb area, they leave with two different conclusions. Peter leaves the tomb area in a state of perplexity, not sure what he should do with the evidence. This is recorded primarily by Luke, but John recording John's response. John walked away from the tomb area believing that a resurrection had indeed occurred. As we come to section 186, we have the first appearance to Mary Magdalene. She returns to the tomb area, still assuming that somebody had merely moved the body. And while she is weeping, the angels are there, but at this point their reflecting glory has been dimmed and they look like simply as young men. And so the angel asks her, "Why are you weeping?" And she answers in verse 13 of John, "Because they have taken away my Lord, I know not where they have laid him." That is what she believes at this stage. At this point, Yeshua finally appears to the first person. And that's the same question in John verse 15. "Well, woman, why do you weep? Whom are you seeking?" And assuming he might be the gardener, she doesn't recognize him right away. But assuming he might be the gardener, could he tell her where the body is so that she could take care of it from there? And in verse 16, he then calls her by name in a way which was familiar to her. And that's when she recognizes who he is and says in Hebrew, Rabbani, which is to say teacher. And apparently she began moving towards him, but Yeshua warns her and tells her, touch me not. That's in verse 17. For I'm not yet ascended to the Father. And the question this raises is, why is she prohibited to touch him when Thomas, a week later, will be able to touch him? And one common answer is that there are two different Greek words, and that part is a fact. There are two different Greek words. The one used in case of Miriam means to hang on to cling. In the picture, she's trying to cling to him so he cannot go away, and go away he must. Whereas the one used a week later is a different Greek word meaning to feel or to touch, but doesn't carry the concept of clinging. And that would be one valid answer because two different Greek words are used. There's a second option I prefer, because notice the reason he gives her why she cannot touch him. Because I have not yet ascended to the Father. Now, according to Hebrews chapter 9, verses 11, 12, and 24, Hebrews 9, 11, 12, and 24, and chapter 10, verse 12, 10, 12. At some point, Yeshua had to go into heaven to sprinkle his blood on the heavenly sanctuary. While it was permissible to use animal blood to cleanse the earthly sanctuary, the cleansing of the heavenly sanctuary required better blood, innocent human blood, Messiah's blood. And therefore he has had to ascend into heaven to sprinkle that blood. Now the background is the ritual of the Day of Atonement, because on that one day, the high priest would take off his multicolored garments, undergo ritual immersion, and then put on the garments he only wore once a year, the white garments. And he would then proceed with the whole ritual. And then he would take off the white garments, undergo a second ritual immersion, and go back to his multicolored garments. Now, from the time he underwent this first immersion, the high priest was untouchable until all of the Day of Atonement ritual was complete. If anyone touched him, he rendered the high priest unclean, and he would not be able to proceed with the full ritual atonement for that Day of Atonement. So with the founder ritual, he had been just resurrected. He had not yet ascended into heaven for the purpose of sprinkling the blood on the heavenly sanctuary. And for that reason, he was untouchable. So following this discussion, he would ascend to heaven and sprinkle his blood. So the second appearance, we'll notice, he's able to be touched, not merely to feel, but also to cling in some way. As to why the heavenly tabernacle need the cleansing of blood, the answer lies in Ezekiel chapter 28, verses 11 through 19. Ezekiel 28, 11 through 19, that when Satan fell, he defiled the heavenly sanctuaries. And because he defiled the heavenly sanctuaries, it needed the cleansing of better blood. Also notice the first appearance of the resurrected Messiah is to a woman, not to a man. And this is very significant because under Jewish rabbinic law, women were not considered to be people whose testimony you could trust. They were not trustworthy witnesses. And so the 2 or 3 witnesses needed in any court of law, they had to be men, not women. Women's testimony was simply untrustworthy. Now, if this was a fabrication, as unbelievers claim, then it would be a Jewish fabrication. These are Jewish authors. But if Jews wanted to fabricate a story, the last thing they would do is to write that the first witness to the resurrected Messiah was a woman and not a man, to make it as believable as possible. But they had to write it this way. You know why? Because this is the way it actually happened. The first witness was a woman, and this argues for its authenticity. It argues against it being a fabrication. This is not the way the Jews would have fabricated the story. He then instructs her to inform the disciples that she had seen the Lord. But when she does report in Mark's account, verse 11, that when they heard it, he was alive and had been seen of her, disbelieved. Now, section 187, the second appearance. The other woman now returned to the tomb area, and the second appearance is also to a woman, to a group of women. So this also argues against this being a Jewish fabrication. This is not the way the Jews were chosen to fabricate it. They want to make it as believable as possible, and so the early witnesses will be men. But again, they have to report it this way because it really happened this way. But notice what happens in verse 9. And behold, Yeshua met them, saying, All hail. And they came and took hold of his feet. They didn't just merely touch the feet, they took hold of it, as a form of clinging. And they were not prohibited from doing so. That shows the ascension for the purpose of sprinkling the blood in the heavenly sanctuary would have occurred between the first and second appearance. And now these women are told to go back to the apostles again and tell them, get out of town already. Head for the Galilee. He'll meet with you once as Messiah arrives in the Galilee. Now, section 188, the report of the God and the beginnings of the rejection of the second son of Jonah. The Roman guard finally got their act together and ran away. What they do not do is go directly to Pontius Pilate, because it shows that they failed to make sure the body does not get moved. And they're probably suspicious that if they told Pilate the real story, he would be rather skeptical about them seeing an angel from heaven rolling the stone away. So what they do is go directly to the elders, go directly to the chief priests, who are the Sadducean members of the Sanhedrin, which then combine with the elders, the Pharisaic members of the Sanhedrin. And they're facing a new crisis. And what they now do is to pay these Roman soldiers a large sum of money. And they're to pass along the streets of Jerusalem telling people, while they were sleeping, the apostles came and stole the body. And what about the issue with the governor? Verse 14, if this come to the governor's ears, we shall persuade him and rid you of care. They promised to intervene if they're called into account. And after Passover, Pilate would go back to Caesarea, a 2-day journey, and he might never hear of this incident to begin with. So, being paid a lot of money, that's what they do. Walking around the streets of Jerusalem saying that while they were sleeping, the apostles came and stole the body. When a Jewish person hears of this, there should be a question arising into his mind. If they were sleeping, how could they possibly know who stole the body? How would they know? Now, because of the death penalty for breaking the Roman seal, only 2 groups would have a vested interest in stealing the body, and the first group would be his enemies. But these are the same enemies in the book of Acts tried to silence the apostolic preaching of the cross and the resurrection. And while they used all kinds of tactics, including using the Jewish scourge to silence them, the apostles refused to be silenced. And the one thing they could do to prove the apostles wrong is to produce the body. And if they had the body, they would have done so, but they do not do so, showing that they did not have the body. And the second group that would have a vested interest are his own friends, the apostles. But these are the apostles that within the book of Acts suffer a great deal of physical abuse because of the message they're giving. And one of the apostles in chapter 12 of Acts, it becomes the first apostolic martyr. And if the traditions of church history are accurate, of these 11 men, 10 died the death of a martyr. Some died rather hideous deaths. Peter was crucified upside down. One was boiled alive in oil. One or two was flayed alive. What that means is they stretch your body out, you're naked, and they then peel your skin off your body while you're living. And in most cases, they gave them two possible options. One was to recant and be released, or recant and die a more humane death. And it's impossible to believe that they're going to die such horrendous deaths for something they all knew was a lie. The only way to explain their sufferings in Acts and the traditions beyond Acts is they firmly believed a resurrection had taken place. So while the stolen body theory is the oldest theory for the empty tomb, it really doesn't make a lot of logical sense on either side. Now, section 189, the third appearance on the Emmaus Road. Here we have the account of two disciples walking back to the town of Emmaus, apparently where they lived. And while they were walking from Jerusalem to Emmaus, they were discussing the recent issues involving what happened to Yeshua. And as they're working, suddenly a third figure joins himself to them and asks them, "What is it that you have been discussing?" Only one of these two disciples are named. His name is Cleopas in verse 18. He was not among the apostolic group of 12, but he was one of the outer disciples, perhaps among the 70. Only he is named probably because he will have a special role in causing the congregation of Jerusalem to leave the city in around the years between 66 and 68 AD, before the Romans come again and destroy the city in 70. So just in what they were talking about, notice what they mention. And what they point out, there were four things they had up until this point believed. And this is Sunday afternoon. Number one, they believed this Yeshua to be a prophet of God. He received direct revelation from God the Father. Secondly, that he was authenticated by his words and by his works. Thirdly, he talks about how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death, delivered him to the Romans, underwent the Roman trial, underwent the crucifixion. And fourthly, the fourth thing they believed up until now is that they believed him to be the Messianic king, though these recent events seems to negate what they had earlier believed. The one thing they had disbelieved, they point out, is in verse 22 and 23, that certain women of our company amazed us, having been early in the tomb, amazement of a report of his resurrection. And when the men went out to discover us, they found nothing in the tomb. And the women even claimed to have seen angels telling him that Yeshua was alive. Now look at the middle of verse 21. Yea, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things came to pass. Sunday afternoon is still only the third day. And that includes his arrest by the Jewish authorities, him transferring him to the Roman authorities, having the Romans crucify him, and now these early reports of the resurrection, and it's still only the third day. Only way Sunday afternoon could still be only the third day is if he did die on a Friday. Move it to a Thursday, Wednesday, or Tuesday, Sunday afternoon can no longer be only the third day. So what Yeshua now does, in verses 25 and 26 and 27, he scolds them for their unbelief. And then in verse 27, giving them a lesson in messianic prophecy, meaning prophecies about the first coming, including the Torah of Moses, but also the prophets, showing that these are things that have been already prophesied. So instead of being shaken to disbelief about his messiahship, these things all affirm his messiahship. When they finally arrive in Emmaus, he's invited to have dinner with them. And verse 30 says, it came to pass when he had sat down with them to meat, he took the bread and blessed it, and breaking it, he gave to them. Now normally the one who does the blessing over the bread is the host. And the guest did not do that, but if the guest is a scriptural scholar, then he gets to say the blessing over the bread, and with his exposition of Messianic prophecy, they recognized him to be the Bible scholar, and therefore have him say the blessing over the bread. And just at that second, in verse 31, their eyes were opened, and they recognized who he is. And just as quickly, he simply disappears from the scene, which now causes them to go back to Jerusalem to inform the apostolic group. As Mark's account, verses 12 and 13 show, even this one, which is now male witnesses, their witnesses also disbelieved. Now, section 190, the fourth appearance is to Peter. The first member of the apostolic group, then, to see the resurrected Messiah happens to be Peter, probably necessary to reaffirm him in the faith in light of his previous threefold denial. So he's the first apostle to see the resurrected Messiah. He's not going to be comforted of his denial to reestablish him in the faith. Now we come to section 191, which is the fifth appearance to 10 of the 11 disciples. It is now Sunday night, and guess what? They never left Jerusalem, as now they've been told 3 times to do. And in John's account, verse 19, they have locked themselves inside a room. The doors were locked for the fear of the Jews. And suddenly Yeshua appears among them. And in the end of John verse 19, he greets them with the typical Hebrew greeting, Shalom Aleichem, peace be unto you. But now when 10 of the 11 apostles finally do see him, there's again a measure of disbelief. And in Luke verse 37, they thought they were looking at a ghost and not looking at a resurrected being. So he scolds them, first of all, in Mark's account, verses 14 and 15. He scolds them for their unbelief, and unbelief has been manifested in 3 ways. Number 1, they failed to depart for Galilee, as they've been told 3 times to do. Secondly, they failed to believe the preceding witnesses, which by now have been both women and men. And thirdly, when they finally see him, they think they're looking at a ghost. So to prove he's not a ghost, he has them do two things. First of all, in Luke's, this would be Luke's account. See my hands and my feet, is myself, handle me, and see, for a spirit does not have flesh and bone, as you see me having. And by feeling him and feeling flesh and bone, that would show he's a real person, not a ghost. When they still have trouble believing, he asks them to have something to eat, and they hand him a broiled fish, which he took and ate. And that proves that he's a resurrected individual, not a ghost. So tell me the truth, have any of you ever seen any ghost eating anything? I bet none of you have ever seen a ghost eating anything. Well, that proves my point. Ghosts don't eat. Resurrected individuals have the capacity to eat. That's good news, because remember, we who believe at the bride of the Messiah, we have yet to attend our own wedding feast. Would have been a very terrible disappointment to go to our own wedding feast, not be able to eat anything. With resurrected and glorified bodies, we do not need to eat to stay alive. We simply can eat for the sheer enjoyment of it. And I have more good news for you. In that day you shall be able to eat as much as you want and never gain an ounce of weight. Messianic aerobics is for this age only. It won't be necessary for the future age. Now, in this post-resurrection appearances, he'll give them three final commissions, and here's the first of these. And they received authoritative ministry, and they're being sent by the Son. And so as the Son went with the authority of the Father, now they can go out with the authority of the Son. And also there was an extension of apostolic authority, was initially given strictly to Peter, is now given to the other apostles. That's in John's account, verse 23, whosoever sins ye forgive, they are forgiven. Unto them whosoever sins ye retain, they are retained. Now this is not forgiving sins in a salvation sense. Only God can forgive sins in a salvation sense. This is forgiving or retaining sin in a disciplinary sense. And like Peter, the apostles are given equal authority to retain sin to the point of physical death, as Peter will do with Ananias and Sapphira. But the church can only go as far as excommunication, but cannot declare any death sentence. Now look at John verse 22. And when he had said this, he breathed on them and said unto them, receive ye the Holy Spirit. This is not the baptism of the Spirit. That won't happen until Acts 2, verses 1 through 4. This is one of the other ministries of the Spirit, the one Paul describes in 1 Corinthians chapters 2 and 3. 1 Corinthians chapter 2 or 3, where the Spirit gives the believer the mind of illumination. They can understand spiritual truth. Again, he tried to teach them some very important things, at least 4 different times recorded. He spelled out the program of death and resurrection, but each time he spelled it out, it also said they did not understand what he was saying. And when these things happened, it caught him by surprise. Now in the 40-day period between resurrection and ascension, they have a lot to learn in preparation for the work in the book of Acts. So the Spirit they now receive is to the Spirit's ministry of illumination. And now they can be able to understand things they did not understand heretofore. Now section 192. Now, at the end of the previous one, you would think now that 10 of these apostles had seen him, early in the morning, they'll pack up and head for Galilee. But as John's account, verse 24, points out, there was one apostle that wasn't with them, and that was Thomas. And Thomas says, you're all deceived. Until I feel, until I see, I will not believe. So in section 192, 8 days pass, and guess where they still are? They're still in Jerusalem. It's a 3-day walk to Galilee from Jerusalem, so they could have walked for 3 days and received teaching for 5 days. Now 8 days have passed, and they haven't seen him. So once again, in this grace, he appears to them while they're in Jerusalem. And focusing on Thomas in verse 27, reach here your finger and see my hands. Reach here your hand and put into my side, and be not faithless but believing. And it took that kind of experience for Thomas to believe. And so he says in verse 28, my Lord and my God. And sometimes we work with the presupposition that it was easier for the apostles to believe because they had seen him resurrected, and therefore they were recipients of greater blessing. Now, it might be easier to believe by this kind of experience, but that's not the way to receive the greater blessing. Because notice what it says in verse 29, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are they that have not seen and yet have believed. And the greater blessing goes out to those who are willing to believe based upon the testimony of Scripture and not needing experience to be convinced to believe. Now, Thomas's confession, my Lord and my God, happens to be the theme that John has been developing throughout his Gospel, so he reaches his conclusion. He will add an appendix, which will be John chapter 21, but now notice how he draws his conclusion. And in verse 30, many other signs therefore did Yeshua in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. And of the many signs, he only chooses to report on 7 of them, 7 signs. He says, these 7 signs should be sufficient to get you to believe Yeshua is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. Now we come to section 193. At long last, guess what they finally got to? They finally got to the Galilee. Now they're hearing already that he'll soon be departing from them for a much longer period. And not yet understanding their new mission and commission. They feel that now that he's leaving, they have to go back to the fishing business. They've been away from this for 3 years. And 7 of the 11 were fishermen by profession. This is just a result of not yet understanding the new commission. So they go fishing and end up catching nothing. And when it's finally is the breaking of day, which by then you would not be able to catch fish in the daytime if you couldn't catch them at night, Yeshua appears on the beachfront and asks the question, have you caught anything? They answer no. So he tells them to do something in verse 6 that normally would not make any difference. Throw the net on the other side of the boat, from the left side to the right side of the boat, and you shall find. And again, from their own fishing experience, they would know this would not make a difference, but it makes a tremendous difference, and they catch a multitude of fish. This is very similar to their original call to full-time discipleship in section 45, when he called them to full-time discipleship, and he'll make them fishers of men. And because of this similarity, John recognizes who's on the shoreline and tells Peter in verse 7, it is the Lord. So what Peter does is jump overboard and makes his way to the shoreline. And he does bring in a very large catch of fish. When they arrive on the shoreline, they notice they don't need a single fish that they caught. Because Yeshua has a fire going, fish roasting or broiling, and bread already baked. And what they need to learn from all this is that they are being called to a full-time mission, the mission they'll be fulfilling in the book of Acts. And God will provide for all their needs. They do not need to go back to the fishing business. Now the full number of fish they caught was in verse 11, 153 fish. And some expositors having trouble believing the text where it is. For a while I was teaching that they don't do it anymore because the numbers are not the same. But at one time, the United Nations had a full membership of 153 nations, and therefore these 153 fish represent the 153 nations of the United Nations. That's not the reason it says 153. I happen to know the real reason why it says 153 has nothing to do with the United Nations. And I'll tell you what the real reason is. The reason it says 153 fish is because they caught 153 fish. It's that simple. The only point that John makes of it, notice, and for all, there was so many, the net was not rent. Because the nature of the nets they used in those days, that many fish in one net will cause the net to be torn apart. So it simply implies a minor miracle. When they finish eating their breakfast, Yeshua has a private discussion with Peter. And Peter's previous threefold denial is now canceled by a threefold affirmation of love. In English, sadly, we only have one word, but in Greek there are two different words being used. There are three different Greek words for love, but two of these appear here. The first word is phileo, and that's a love of the emotions, a response to attraction. It's also a love of friendship. So people who are very close friends have a phileo love for each other. The second word used is agapao, which is the verb, or agape, which is the noun. And that is viewed as being a greater love because it's a love of the will. You can exercise your will to love even the most unloving people in the world. When the Bible commands us to love everybody, we don't have the capacity to phileo everybody. But we have the capacity as believers to agape everybody. Now, it wasn't you speaking Greek here, but the Hebrew equivalents for phileo is the word ra'aya, and for agape is the word ahava. So as we follow this discussion between him and Peter, I'll try to break down how the words are being used. So the first interchange is in verse 15. So when they had broken their fast, Yeshua said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And this is using the word agape. "Peter, do you really love me more than the other apostles love me?" And the reason he would put it this way, more than these, is because at the last Passover, that's the kind of love Peter claimed to have. And when Yeshua said they'll all disperse him, Peter said, "Well, maybe all these other guys will leave you. I will never leave you. I will die for you." And he claimed to have an agape love for Yeshua. So in light of his experience, do you really agape me more than the others do? Peter answers, "Yea, Lord, you know that I love you," but he uses the word phileo. And the point is, I can no longer claim that I agape you more than the others, but this much I can tell you, I do phileo you, I'm your friend. And he receives the first of his three commissions, feed my lambs. and lambs are baby believers that need to be fed with the milk of the Word of God, he'll fulfill this requirement. One way he fulfills it is by writing the epistle of 1 Peter. It's written to fairly newborn Jewish believers. And in chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, chapter 2, verses 1 through 3 says, desire the milk of the Word of God that you may grow thereby. And the milk of the Word is for baby believers not yet ready for the meat. In verse 16, there's a second interchange. He said to him again a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? But now he drops the phrase more than these, but he does use the word agape again. All right, Peter, you can no longer affirm that you agape me more than the others. Can you at least affirm that you agape me at least equally? And Peter answers in verse 16. He said to him, yea, Lord, you know that I love you, using again the word phileo. His answer means that, well, I cannot affirm that I agape you more than the others, or even that I agape you at all at this stage, but this much I can affirm, I do phileo you. I am your friend. He then receives the second commission, tend my sheep. The word tend means to exercise oversight, authority. He fulfills this role as the chief of the apostles in the book of Acts. Now comes the third interchange in verse 17. He said to him the third time, do you love me? But now he uses the word Peter's been using. Do you phileo me? All right, Peter, you cannot affirm that you agape me more than the others, nor can you affirm to me you agape me at all, but can you truly affirm that you phileo me? And we're told in verse 17, and he said to him, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And again uses the word phileo. Yes, Lord, I can no longer affirm I agape you more than the others. I cannot affirm I agape you at all, but this much I truly can affirm. I do phileo you. I am your friend. And now he receives the third commission, feed my sheep. Sheep are all the believers who need to be fed with the meat of the Word of God. He'll fulfill this function in the writing of 2 Peter, written to Jewish believers of a greater maturity. So Peter's earlier threefold denial is now canceled by this threefold affirmation of love. But then he tells Peter in verse 18 and 19, a day will come that he will prove he can show, and he will prove that he has agape love for Yeshua, not more than the others, but at least equally, because he will not die of old age. He will die the death of a martyr. So Peter's been just told not to anticipate dying of old age. So what Peter does is point to John and says, what about that guy over there? And Yeshua tells Peter, well, basically, that's none of your business. And so in verse 22, if I will that he tarry till I come, what is that to you? You follow me. In other words, Peter's concern should be to fulfill his own calling by God. And John's concern should be John's calling for God's will. So it's a call for Peter just to follow total discipleship. And Peter one day proved that he has agape love by means of being willing to be crucified, even crucified upside down. And the same thing for all of us here. If there are believers, we must be concerned in fulfilling our own calling and not worry about what other people are doing in fulfilling their calling. So in verse 24, he summarizes, this is the disciple that bears witness of these things and wrote these things, and we know that his witness is true. And he points out he was an eyewitness of many of these events he recorded in his gospel. And in verse 25, also many other things which Yeshua did, that which if they should be written every one, I suppose that even the world itself would not contain the books that should be written. So based upon this verse, I went through the harmony to try to count how many days of his life, which was about 35, 6 or 7 years, how many days of his life are actually recorded. And only 75 up to 80 days are on record. That's it. But what he accomplished in the 75 to 80 days which are recorded is sufficient to prove to all that he is the Messiah, the Son of God, and believing it to have life in his name. Alrighty, we'll take our break and then we'll finish the life of Messiah.